And his last trout was caught on a Yorkshire spider. And here's a framing. I can't really see
Oh, wow,
it.
okay.
But there's 10 Yorkshire spiders tied by Vince Marinaro and signed by him.
Lifelong angler and self-confessed knowledge sponge, New Yorker John Shaner knows the fly fishing industry inside and out. A collector, fly fishing historian, bamboo rod fan with a fascination for English wet flies, John's role as technical specialist with Pure Fishing, the owners of Hardy Greys, give a clue to his standing within the industry. John lives a stone's throw away from the Catskills Fly Fishing Museum and has fished all over the world. He also tells a fine story. Join me now in conversation with John Shaner. So, John, welcome and thank you ever so much for joining us for this chat. I'm really gutted at the moment because in just a few days' time we were due to be meeting up in God's own country in the Yorkshire Dales and fishing soft-hackle wet flies together. So, one or two things have conspired against us in that respect, it seems.
Well, nobody's more disappointed about that than I am, Paul. And, a chance to spend some time with you again was going to be a highlight of that trip. And, Yorkshire, I've been very fortunate to have fished a lot of places. And Yorkshire is just, it's blown me away what I've seen of it in the few trips I've made over there. And it's so much the type of fishing that I love the most. And the countryside is spectacular. The fishing's very good too.
Yeah,
it's very similar to our Catskills fishing.
Really, see, that's one of the things on my bucket list. So I definitely want to get over there at some point and sample some of that and get into.
We can take care of that for you. That's easily.
So I wasn't fishing for that, but hey,
Yeah, well, you're always welcome. You're always welcome. Yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, John, if you'll forgive me, you've been around in this game forever now, and you must have seen a lot of changes come and go. But before we get into that, I mean, can you even remember that very first fish, that experience that kind of hooked you on the whole thing?
I don't remember a time when I didn't fish and I didn't read. It's a bit precocious on both. But I actually remember very, very well my first trout on a fly. And on a fly I tied myself. And it was 1966. It was our Memorial Day, which is towards the end of May. And behind my grandparents' little farm in southwestern New York, there was a small trout stream. And I can still see that fish coming up for that fly. And I put him in an old battered milk bucket and took him up. And my dad was laying across the front seat of our 57 Pontiac Chieftain, probably with an Iron City beer, listening to the Indianapolis 500. I mean, I remember it like it happened last week. And I was hooked. I mean, I came from a family of anglers, not fly anglers, but I had opportunity to fly fish where I grew up in the Finger Lakes. And the reading part was a big component of that. We lived out in the country, and when my mom would go into town, she would drop me at the public library, and we had a wonderful public library, and it was full of great classic fly fishing books. So at a very early age, I was reading basic fly angling books. And the Catskills are only about a 2-hour drive from where I grew up. So as soon as I had wheels under me, I was in the Catskills. It all kind of went from there.
Well, there's worse places to have a kind of a formative set of experiences in fly fishing, right?
Yeah, and one of the changes I've seen is that in central New York, we had a lot of wonderful small stream trout fishing, and very little of it is left due to climate change or urbanization or posting or any of a number of other factors. So it was a bit of a paradise for a kid that liked to fish. And I could ride my bike. We grew up on one of the Finger Lakes, a large lake that was full of trout. And we learned to fish, I guess you guys would call it lock style, literally in front of the house. And in the spring, the fish would run up the little creeks, and we'd catch we catch with big old gray nymphs up to 7 or 8 pounds, in these little creeks. It was really amazing. I haven't seen anything like it since. So.
Yeah, and again, you sort of obviously you must have seen many different tactics and many different trends in the sport and that kind of thing. I mean, what are some of the standout sort of either developments or the shifts that you've seen either in the industry or just in the activity itself as well at a grassroots level?
Well, that's a big question. I'm old enough to remember when bamboo was still the best material for fly rods. I mean, glass was around. But in terms of a truly well casting fly rod, you saved your money and you bought an Orvis or a Leonard or one of the other really good rods. And it was especially in upstate New York and the Catskills, it was pretty much a dry fly game. We fished nymphs, but weighted flies were relatively new. I mean, we occasionally load some hare's ear nymphs with lead wire. But when graphite started coming out in the mid-'70s, about the time I was hitting my stride, it was a new kind of unproven material and was really about 8 or 10 years before it became the standard. And they got the bugs out of it. And that changed a lot. And then suddenly, the average guy could learn to cast pretty well. Graphite really had an impact on that. And I won't say I resisted graphite, but for the type of fishing I did, cane was still what I preferred. And then I really embraced graphite, with both arms. And at about that time too, I shifted a lot of my focus to the West, where you were catching a lot of larger fish and putting a lot of strain on tackle. And it's one thing to put that kind of strain on an expensive cane rod, which in some cases may not necessarily be replaceable, or a factory-built graphite. But I would say, and I've given this quite a bit of thought over the years, I would say the single largest change that I've seen in fly fishing, and it's actually 3 things that came together, 3 elements that came together in the late 80s and early 1990s. It was the rise of the popularity of tailwater fisheries, especially in the West. The strike indicator and the beadhead nymph. And when these 3 things all came together in the late 80s, suddenly you had a way to catch fish that was almost foolproof. And at that time, I was doing some guiding in Montana. And a lot of the clients we would get would have very low, skill levels. But you could take them to a river like the Bighorn or the Missouri or the Madison or, the rivers in the park and so forth. And you could set them up with a beadhead or a pair of beadheads under a suspendent type indicator and just let them drift that through a run. And just by default, sooner or later, they're going to catch something.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people that came into the sport as it really boomed in the 80s and 90s, this was their introduction. And they really never left it. This becomes the default way to catch trout today. To the point where, I even see dry fly anglers being ridiculed. And
well, why make life difficult for yourself, right?
Well, exactly. Look, I was one of the first ones I knew that fished beadheads and strike indicators. And if I may say so, I got fairly good at it. I was getting a lot of practice fishing at that time.
Yeah.
And what I found, though, is you reach a certain point, you didn't learn much more. And what I love most about fly fishing is that you can pursue it in a lot of different ways. But what I really love most about it is that you never stop learning. And I found that my learning curve flattened after a while with that system. And again, nothing against it. It gets a lot of people into the sport. But if there's something I would wish today, it would be that people would break out of that, would take off those training wheels, as it were.
Yeah,
and
and I think
try other things.
yeah, I think there's a lot in the idea that you with a tool, any tool, which
Yeah,
nymphing under an indicator is a tool. You've got a choice. You can either hold it by the handle or the blade, right? So it's up to
right.
you how you use it. And
Yeah,
if you have no further curiosity to kind of progress beyond that or understand more than that, then for me personally, I think you miss out on some of the richness of the sport. But then, if you're happy what you're doing, then I guess that's also fine too.
yeah. I have no quarrel with anybody that and it certainly is an efficient way to catch fish, but not always. And I think
Mm.
a lot of people they paint themselves into a corner with it. One thing I have seen in the last decade, and really more so in the last 5 years, is the rise in popularity and this is how I know you, spider style flies
Mm.
have become very, very popular, where even 10 or a dozen years ago, it was a very arcane form of the sport over here. And today it seems like that's all I hear about, which is wonderful.
And that's
Because
really interesting because
yeah,
it's out of a very different branch of the English and, well, let's say British traditions. It's a very, very separate discipline from the chalk stream stuff, which obviously
mm-hmm,
travels extremely well overseas and to the States included. Obviously, you have the comparable sort of Spring Creek sort of fishing over there. But yeah, it's interesting to me that what is even in the UK is quite an esoteric branch. It seems to be drawing some new advocates and new addicts, if you will. So I think it's a real positive thing, and it gladdens the heart because obviously I'm from that part of this
yeah,
country.
right,
So
right,
yeah.
right. And the flies are relatively simple to dress. They're very effective. I just am really surprised at how much they've taken off here just in the last few years.
For you personally as well, I mean, the more generalized interest notwithstanding, for you personally, is there an additional layer of interest because it comes with a literature that you can discover where you've got different people writing about this stuff back in the day as well?
Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And being a reader and being a book collector, being an addict, you could take the shotgun approach, which a lot of people do, and which I did to begin with. But then I began to focus on the development of wet flies and nymphs. And one of the things that's very interesting is how much the British had accomplished so much earlier than we had in the States. So much of our fly fishing, not necessarily traditions, but the technical aspects of the sport have been borrowed from the British. And there was an awful lot of connection between, especially the Anglers Club of New York and the Fly Fishers Club of London. And a lot of this knowledge came, from that, from those relationships. But you take, for instance, in 1836, Alfred Ronalds publishes the Fly Fisher's Entomology. We didn't get anything like that until 99 years later with Preston Jennings. And meanwhile, the Brits had been, this had been, had become very familiar territory for this type of information. But to the point of the spider style flies, Jack Nicholson told me never to drop names, but so I knew Sil Nems a little bit, and Sil Nems is the kind of the soft-hackle guru over here. And one time I said to Sil, I said, you cost me an awful lot of money because I had to have every book that you mentioned in your writings, Pritt and Edmonds and Lee and on and so forth. As you dig deeper into that, it's a very, very broad, very, very wonderful literature. And there's a magic to dressing these flies as close to possible, as closely as possible to the originals that would have been recognized a couple hundred years ago, in Yorkshire, and then, on the wharf, and then catching trout, whether it's on the beaver kill or the fire hole or whatever. Trout don't change. We change.
Absolutely.
Trout still respond to the same things.
Yeah, I mean, some of my Japanese friends say that trout doesn't speak Japanese or English, so the flies that that hit that biological kind of trigger is that's, you're good to go, sort of thing. It's interesting. I'll sort of send some love back over the Atlantic as well, because I think that in the UK, I think we got a real kick in the pants from some of the developments in dry fly fishing that came back across the Atlantic into our sort of fishing culture, and to a degree streamer fishing as well. I think has really innovated some of the stuff that goes on over here. And I think it took us a long time to get out of only fishing, casting upstream with dry flies, and going smaller with some of the dry flies. And I'd definitely say that a lot of the American people pushing that certainly benefited our fly fishing over here. And of course, there's a big European tradition, a continental European tradition of
which is interesting, because we don't think much about what was going on in the continent. In the French, I've never fished in France, but I really want to. Very sophisticated fly fishing culture over there.
And they're real detail orientated sort of anglers as well. And I think because they have a lot of fairly heavy pressure catch and kill streams as well. If you're going to be any good and consistently succeed on those, you got to be way to that right hand side of the curve, the distribution curve. So they produce some astonishing anglers.
Yeah, to your point about American flies coming your way, I had to get a laugh the first time I fished the chalk streams. They said, bring big wolf flies. And I just, it was, it was almost like bringing Oreo cookies to high tea or something, it was just like, I was shocked. I was really shocked.
Well, one of the things I was interested to read was, I think, Halford sending some dry flies over to the Catskills, but then they for those fish, they had to be kind of, made a bit sparser and made a little bit more, less kind of in your face than the ones that were on those rich, kind of lush, high chalk sort of content waters, compared to the waters that they went over to and ultimately developing into that Catskill style.
Well, absolutely. And having really grown up in what's called the Catskill School of Fly Tying, these very sparse dry flies, and the real exemplar of that Catskill school, I believe, was a man by the name of Rube Cross, who just tied the most exquisite, workman-like sparse dry flies that are very, very hard to emulate, because they just take such a light hand, but they're very effective. Now, Theodore Gordon was sent the patterns by Frederick Halford, and those still exist in the Anglers Club of New York. And Gordon dismissed them pretty quickly as not being very suitable for American waters. And, it's one of the wonderful things about having been very fortunate to have traveled a lot of places. You can see why things develop the way they do. And, Gordon makes the jump to the fully formed Catskill dry fly very, very quickly. It wasn't a long, drawn-out process. It was almost automatic. Certainly there was a lot of influence from Halford, and even a lot of his fly patterns carried the English names, but Whirling Dun was one of the early favorites. But they were very, very different right off. And it was sparse, generally much longer hackles, thin bodies, because on a Catskills river, and again, there's an awful lot of similarities between a river like the Wharf. I don't mean to just belabor the Wharf, or some of the other northern rivers that I've fished, and the Catskills. I feel very, very much at home. We call them pool and riffle rivers, where a day on a Catskill river could be a flat pool with almost no movement in it at all, and at the head of the pool, you're fishing riffle water, pocket water. and you don't change flies. So you need a fly that's going to kind of cover all that ground. So the Catskill fly is really a marvel of engineering too. They're often dressed very wrong, though.
Yeah.
And here's where I'm opinionated. When you look at the true early Catskill flies, the Steenrods and Cross and Christian and these guys that really tied the first very effective ones past Borden, they're very lightly dressed, and most modern anglers would find them too sparse to fish. But there's a level of sophistication that was going on in the Catskills. And this is true of the tackle too. And a very good friend of mine and I in the last few years have done a lot of research into the type of tackle they were using, the type of rods. And Leonard Rod Company, which is so famous over here, we're building extremely sophisticated light line rods for the Catskills as early as the 1890s. And some of these rods weighed barely over 2 ounces. And they were for delivering these tiny or very, very sparse Catskill dry flies. It didn't these were not for the average guy. But the fact that Leonard produced the Catskill series of rods for almost 100 years, well, over 70 years, really tells you something about the success of that tackle.
Absolutely. It's interesting. It puts me in mind a little bit of a different connection that we have, which is the Roger Woolley who tied the Cutcliffe flies that you so kindly, and I'd be eternally grateful for that, and to your brother for the photography of the same, of that collection of flies. But Roger Woolley tied and sold in his catalogue the what he termed utility flies, and these were very, very sparsely glossy hackled, quite long hackles, but sparse rooster hackled patterns. And he called them utility flies because you could either grease them up and fish them sort of in the surface film as a dry fly, or you could let them become swamped and submerge and fish them as a wet fly as well in different parts of the river. And again, there's almost nothing to them, these little wisps of flies. They're just a suggestion of life. And I think that's a similar aesthetic that it sounds like that the development of the Catskills flies and some of the more famous patterns, there's the Quill Gordons and whatever, but particularly the ones that you're talking about there with that ultralight approach, I think there's a similar or parallel, at least, line of thinking there, which is really interesting to see that parallel development.
Yeah, I own and have seen a lot of Roger Woolley flies, and they, exactly as you say, they're marvels of sparseness. He was doing little flying ants and things that are just so far ahead of their time, in a lot of ways. And which leads me into another thought, is that when a particular fly is taken up commercially, they're often overdressed because people that buy flies want to see a lot of stuff on the hook. And I won't name names, but a lot of the classic Catskill fly tyers understood this, and you see this progression into more heavily dressed flies. And then when
I've done more paid for those materials, you better
exactly,
give it to
it's one of the reasons I really believe that spider style flies took so long to catch on. There's just not enough stuff on the damn hook to warrant somebody paying $2.50 for it. They want to see a lot of materials on the hook.
But I think, of course, the paradox there is that simplicity comes with a great deal of. It's very difficult to tie sparsely well. It's like great cooking, great cuisine that 3 perfect ingredients and don't mess about with it. But that simplicity, it only comes on the far side of a lot of hard work and going through complexity to get back to that simplicity again.
That's absolutely right, and just like a truly good chef knows how to get the most out of a few ingredients. The same is true with fly tying, and truly great flies. And I think of a couple of them, and especially something as just absolutely brilliant as Sawyer's pheasant tail. that fly is just, I still marvel at that fly. I mean, it's just pheasant tail fibers and copper wire, but the way it's put together, and frankly, I would rather sight fish pheasant tails than anything else I can think of. Just it's a mechanical marvel of fly fishing. It really is.
I forget who said it, but I think they were talking about cane rods at the time. But the quote goes something, and people who know far better than me will be able to correct me on this. But the quote goes something like, it took me a long, long time to realize that all I needed was, a simple cane rod and a silk line and a very simple fly. And it took me even longer to realize that's all I wanted. Eventually I realized that's also all that I wanted. And I think that the pheasant tail, sight fishing with a pheasant tail, which is two, fly tying materials, doesn't even use conventional thread sort of thing. I like that idea of, just arriving at that perfect state, and the idea of perfection being when there's nothing left to take away, right?
You took the words right out of my mouth, yeah. But I think a lot of anglers, I was talking about this with a friend just yesterday. This is, for a lot of us, I think this is what we really pursue for a long time, and then we finally realize what the goal is. What I want to have enough faith in the flies that I fish that I can attribute not catching to my own mistakes.
Nice.
And there's a tremendous amount of reliance on pattern, where the reliance really should be on skill. And this is in any fly fishing discipline. I don't care what it is. You take it away from trout fishing. About 30 years ago, I was very, very, excuse the pun, hooked on bonefish. And they're a wonderful fish. What I found out about bonefish is that you can get it down to just a couple of patterns depending on where you're fishing. And it all comes down to being a sighting and casting game. The reason I finally kind of got away from bonefish is because the take was the same every time. And where trout they're endless things that, they just react so many different ways. But the idea of relying, being able to rely on relatively few fly patterns, which is probably different for everyone, to me is very liberating.
It's interesting because with a bit of a science background, it puts me in mind of the reason, the idea of taking fly out of the equation because you've kind of standardized that, that's acceptable, it's right, so we don't need to worry about that. Yeah. It's sort of the same reason that when people studying behavioral ecology, when they study ants and insects, because instead of having to try and deal with all really complex neurology, when you've got creatures essentially without brains, as you would understand it, right, what you're then looking at, the patterns you're looking at, are the result of complicated selection pressures. So it's a very pure way of looking at the selection pressures that are acting on those individuals and whether they survive and reproduce or not. So I think it's the same thing is taking a very developing enough confidence in a small number of patterns that you then take the gadgetry out of the equation, and then you're left with a very pure fishing skill, streamcraft experiment. That's the variables that you're then working with. And I agree, it is very liberating and also very, very satisfying when you get down to that kind of experience.
It is, and it really, especially in dry fly fishing and in a lot of nymph fishing, it really comes down to drag. And everything is predicated on controlling drag. And by controlling, I don't mean necessarily eliminating it, because there are times when you don't want to eliminate drag. See, you were ready. You were ready.
I'm just busy high-fiving you from the back of the church here. I'm preach on. I'm ready to testify right now.
Yeah, it's about controlling drag and controlling the fly, and simply getting the fish to make a mistake. There was I'll tell a quick fish story. And this one's very fresh in my mind because it happened just last week. And the Hendrickson is our big spring hatch here. And the years are measured in Hendricksons, and unfortunately or fortunately, it's the first good hatch of the year, and the fish just love to fly. So you'll get big fish feeding on them, and it's a beautiful, it's beautiful fly, and it's the great classic in the East. And so to catch a good day of Hendrickson fishing, you want to get at least one a year, and the last time I was out was that day. And I found a very, very large fish rising. And I was watching him, and please take this the right way, but I just knew that as soon as I cast, it was such a setup that I watched the fish for the longest time because I didn't want to break the spell. And the fish ate the fly the first cast just like he was supposed to, and I'll be happy with him as my biggest fish of the year. He was a very large trout, and I'll tell you, when I netted him, my mouth was dry.
Yeah.
So if that, I won't give you pounds or inches or whatever, but
given the length of your career, I think that's it gives an insight into the substantial nature of that fish, shall we say?
But I just love to watch that fish. Here is everything that you think about all winter. In this microcosm here, this fish feeding just as he should, and the head coming up and the flies coming down, and you can hear the gulp, and he's just so content and so happy. Like I say, I almost didn't want to bother him and break the spell, but I did. Yeah. I did. Yeah. I still haven't grown up that much.
Well, I think that's reassuring in a way as well. But I do think that the kind of very short-lived nature of those experiences are, like you say, you spend the whole winter, that's what you sort of picture. So when it does come together like that, it is worth savouring, I think. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah, and in the long run, I mean, we really fish for nothing more than memories.
Yeah.
That's really what we're fishing for. Is it takes us away. And believe me, in a time like this, it was a wonderful day. There's a continuity there. That a day like that can merge into all the other days in my life that have been similar to that. And, and hope for the future too, that these things will continue. And,
very nice. Yeah.
I think fly fishing has I've always been an amateur historian, and the similarities are much greater than the differences between the past and the present. And when you read a lot of the older books, the language might be a bit purple and sometimes the references are obscure, but when you cut through that, I think that we would have been very much at home with most anglers of the past. And they would have been at home with us.
I get on my soapbox about this at every opportunity, so forgive me if this is repetitious to anybody, but I've quietly obsessed with this idea of there being a visitable past within fly fishing, because there's very few other activities where you can go and immerse yourself in essentially an identical experience to somebody 100 years ago. There's not many activities where you can do that, where the challenge and the experience, the elation, the sights, the sounds, your whole day it can be essentially identical to somebody who lived many generations ago. And I think that's there's a definite good feeling of connection to that sort of sense of continuity that you mentioned before.
All that's really changed is the tackle.
Yeah.
All that's really changed is the tackle. And again, that's one of the reasons I love the spiders so much. And it's one of the few flies that I refuse to modify. Because I want them to be as close to original as possible. The same is true with the Catskill dry flies. Outside of that, all bets are off. And I'm very careful about the way I tie my Sawyer pheasant tails. But everything else, gets modified. But when it comes down to some of those traditional flies that have really stood the test of time.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things over the course of my lifetime. I've seen all these wonder flies come and go, and will they still catch fish? Which leads you to the question: does any particular fly catch fish simply because it's fished more?
Yeah. Oh, I'm a huge advocate of the existence of confirmation bias within fly fishing. Is the potential for that is immense.
Yeah. Now, in my early days, when I did fish a lot of the classic Catskill patterns, the difference between a Quill Gordon and a Hendrickson is just the body. And again, being a bit precocious, I questioned why, are the fish that bright? And they're not, but if you feel that the Quill Gordon is going to be a more effective fly, you'll fish it better. Yeah. That's all it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I know we've talked before, you've mentioned that angling has given you lots of opportunities to kind of duck down multiple different side alleys, but I just wondered if there were one or two, particularly engaging sort of, side shoots of activities that you've got into, or aspects of fly angling that particularly give you satisfaction and enjoyment.
Well, you can see one of them right behind my head.
Yeah.
Which is, again, always having been a reader, and not just in fly fishing, but in a lot of subjects. Book collecting has been a lifelong pursuit. And the wonderful things I've learned through that, books as fishing books as an end in themselves, and the pursuit of those, and the occasional rare find. And this is something I share with my book collecting friends, that just the nuances of books, the fact that there's a slight difference on a title page from, the first printing of the second edition and the second printing of the third, or whatever. And you end up with 7 copies of the same book, and some of the most beautiful books of all time have been fly fishing books, especially the specimen books with the actual flies and materials that are tipped into the books, and so there's been I would continue my book collecting, although I've slowed down a bit, and it is the golden age of book collecting for somebody starting a library right now, because book prices are through the floor. It's really a shame, and our libraries are not worth what they were just a few years ago. I never collected as an investment, so that's kind of good for me, because I've been able to buy a few things I never would have been able to afford just a few years ago. And I really have to, stop myself sometimes. But the other thing would be bamboo rods, would be cane rods. And even more so than the books, this really gets into all kinds of worlds. And the really wonderful people I have met, especially the makers, who've become very, very good friends of mine in a lot of cases. To me, and fly fishing, the one of the most important pleasures in fly fishing is casting. And it's one of the reasons that the chuck and duck style of fishing doesn't appeal to me. I've no ethical qualms about it, but I can't cast a thingamabobber the size of a golf ball. And not to be patronizing, but what little I knew about tenkara, and then what you showed me when we fished together, completely turned my head around. Because you can manipulate that rod in a casting way that I did not realize was part of tenkara.
It's for me, it's probably one of the major appeals is the casting aspect of it, which is why it gets my goat a bit when it's introduced in a way that doesn't incorporate that. But again,
yeah, and
there's a
it
whole
had
day's
been
worth
to
of
me.
discussion
So
there.
again, not to be patronizing, but
No.
it really changed my attitude towards it. And I can see the level of skill that that someone could acquire there. But bamboo rods have always fascinated me. I love fine craftsmanship, and especially fine craftsmanship with utility to it. These are wonderful instruments. The amount of thought that goes into a truly fine cane rod is amazing. And I spend hours with my rod making friends talking about the smallest nuances of cane rod design or cane rod finishing or whatever. And it's a wonderful process. And there's a lot of misconceptions about bamboo, that it's fragile, that it doesn't last, would I choose it to make 80-foot casts? No. But within the parameters of where it works best, it's I believe, much more accurate, much more forgiving, and much more tractable than graphite is. A friend of mine believes it's almost impossible to break off a fish on a bamboo rod with light tippet because of the way that it handles the stresses. And it really, graphite has a harshness to it that cane simply doesn't have. Now, I'm not one of these guys that, will say that, a trout that's caught on graphite isn't properly caught. That's, I don't go there. I'm very proud of the fish I catch on graphite, and I don't. But when you catch a special fish on a rod that maybe came from, a fine old maker or one of your friends or whatever, it does add a quality to it.
I mean, I'm like you. I mean, I enjoy really nice high end. I really love really high performance graphite, super modern stuff. That there's an aesthetic and an enjoyment from that. But also, with bamboo, it's just they've got soul. They've got a kind of a quality to them that just adds a different dimension to things, and it's a wonderful and a little bit poetic. There's an element of poetry to the activity when it's in a fine piece of craftsmanship, as you say. And the fact that it's essentially grown out of the ground at the beginning of its life, as before it turned into that fishing tool by the skill of an attention from a craftsman, which is, I think, all those elements together just add up to a wonderful story. And I think the reasons that we're fly fishers or that we're anglers of a style rather than dynamite fishers, it's not just about the having of the fish, it's about the story and the way that you arrive at that capture. And I think cane rods and cane rod building just add levels of meaning and enjoyment to that experience for sure.
Yeah, it's they really become companions, and as long as I've fished these, and this is my whole life, they still amaze me. And there is hardly anything that's more fun than getting together with a few of my buddies and pulling out some favorite rods and here, cast this, try this. Oh, you got it. I have friends that are very good anglers that say the reason they really fish anymore is just to exercise their rods. It's they're just as happy casting as they are fishing.
I think that's a nice place to be.
Yeah, it's an overworked kind of cliche, but it's very similar to wine tasting. And years ago, I was taking some wine tasting classes, and one night it was going to be sweet wines, and you heard these groans from the class, and the instructor was saying, no, it's okay to like sweet wines because a lot of the great wines are sweet wines. And the analogy for this is that we look for performance that emulates graphite, very fast rods. So there's these wonderful slower and medium rods that I liken to sweet wines. It's okay to like a slower rod. And in a lot of cases, some of the most sophisticated tapers are these slower tapers that frankly not everyone can cast or appreciate. Once you do, fast rods become almost like, well, it's just like graphite, you know. And I remember early on when at first, you know, graphite rods tried to emulate cane rod actions. And then the opposite, you know, next thing you knew, you had makers like, well, this is as fast as your favorite graphite. And they built some terrible monstrosities. You know, you didn't know which end to hold. I used to joke about they put the grip on, you know, one end so you'd know which end to hold. You know, and 6.5 foot rods that took 7 weight lines and things like that. But yeah, you could battle a lot of line out with them, but, you know, you might as, you know, a canoe paddle was a better fishing tool. So, but
again, I mean, it's that idea of coming through that complexity and then arriving back at what actually the fundamental things are and rediscovering that. And I think that idea of coming full circle, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, the story of, I mean, you, I believe, fortunate enough to have some of the letters and correspondence with Vince Marinaro and sort of the author of the Ring of the Rise. And the idea for me that he's kind of obviously known as a kind of doyen of dry fly fishing, and then I mean, I'll let you tell the story, but the final fish that he was catching.
Absolutely, he was, and you know, just his books, you know, Modern Dry Fly Code and In the Ring of the Rise, and through a very circuitous path, he became fascinated with Yorkshire style spiders. And you want me to tell this quick?
Please do. Yeah.
About a dozen years ago, I was giving a talk on spider style flies in Pennsylvania. And at the end of the demonstration, it was a very quiet older gentleman who'd sat in front of me the whole time. And I was packing up and I wanted to leave. I, you know, wanted to get home. I had to drive. And I, you know, kind of bluntly said, do you have any questions? And he says, yeah. And he threw some flies on the table. And he says, can you tell me what these are? And my heart stopped. I said, well, those are flies tied with dotterel feathers. And he says, how'd you know that? I said, well, I know. He says, only one other person ever knew that. I said, and who would that be? And he says, Vince Marinaro. Now, I never had the opportunity to meet Vince Marinaro, and he is a great hero of mine. So I was all excited about, you know, his connection with Vince. But then my little mind got working, and I started doing some connections. And I said, well, wait a minute. Marinaro wrote about dotterel hackled flies in his second book. And he said, yeah, the feathers came from a collection that I have, that this gentleman had. And he very offered to show me this collection. So I went down to meet him. We became very good friends. And he had a collection of early Yorkshire materials, fly materials, flies, and manuscripts, one of which was the John Swarbrick manuscript from 1817. And all of this led to my, you know, meeting Rob Smith and subsequently you. But but here in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, here are these wonderful things. And the way that he had found them is they had been collected by a man by the name of Henry Walbrain Cooper, who was from Yorkshire, and subsequently went to a Bennett Millard, who died in California without any heirs except for a niece. His effects went to his niece, who subsequently opened a dress shop in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And my friend was looking for fur scraps to tie flies with. And she asked him what he wanted the fur for. He says, well, for making fishing flies. She said, well, I have some things you might be interested in. They ended up with
Unbelievable.
my friend. My friend showed them to Vince. Vince became absolutely enamored of these things to the point where towards the very end of his life, he was tying and fishing Yorkshire spider flies. And his last trout was caught on a Yorkshire spider. And here's a framing. I can't really
Oh,
see
wow,
it.
okay.
But there's 10 Yorkshire spiders tied by Vince Marinaro and signed by him. So this, and subsequently we photographed and the manuscript and a lot of the materials, and Rob used them in his book on the North Country fly. So, one of the things I wanted to do was bring these to the public's attention. But Marinaro was really a fascinating character. I know a lot of people who knew him, and he was, I guess, gruff was one way to put it. He either liked you or he didn't. But he liked my friend very much, and they were quite close. So I've heard a lot of stories about him. But he was very stubborn too. But his
he'd have done well in Yorkshire, I think.
yeah. No, he made one trip to England to the chalk streams. It was a lifelong ambition. And he had terrible fishing, and they basically dumped him off at this hotel, and he had to walk to the, nobody even, everything fell through, and it's this terribly sad story.
Typical classic British hospitality there.
Yeah, it really was. They put him upstairs in some pub with the music going all night. At that time he was an old man, but he really made the best of it. Never said anything negative. But when you comb through it, he had a terrible time. He was very disappointed. Not in the water or the fishing, but he only got a few hours to fish, actually.
Yeah. But that's a hell of an endorsement for, I guess, North Country spiders from a person so famous for a different branch of our sport as well. So
yeah, and he fished them. He was a classicist. He fished them in the classic way. He was fishing them to visible fish. More like skews would have than in his early days than say they would have been fished in the dales. But I think what really appealed to him was the utility and the delicacy of these flies, where he just excoriated the classic Catskill dry fly. He just saw nothing good about it. But here are these flies, and basically, if you look at these and then compare them to classic Yorkshire spiders, they're he was right there. He was right on them. He just really saw something in them that a lot of people wouldn't have. The fact that he never wrote about it is really kind of tragic. And I often wonder if he'd had another 10 or 20 years, what we would have gotten out of that, with his very analytical mind. So
I think with the simplicity of those flies, you come to an understanding of the materials on a very deep level, I think, and I think people who have that comparable experience in different parts of fly fishing could probably recognise that the level of the understanding of the materials, the properties, and the way that the hackle's set on the hook and that kind of thing in a very fine detail.
It's interesting because that's true of almost any type of fly dressing, especially more sophisticated fly dressing, whether it be spiders or Catskill style flies. And also the understanding of materials when it comes to cane rods. And when you look at the very, very best cane rods, they're very almost monastic, as Ernie Schwiebert called them. Just very, very simple. And they caught onto that a long time ago, that a really good cane rod is not the one with all the trim wraps and the engraved furls. It's the one that's pared down, as you say, when you can't take anything else away from it. And some of the modern makers, people like Per Brandon and Tim Abbott and Leon Hansen and Chris Vance, they're building 8.5-foot cane rods that barely weigh 3 ounces. We're talking graphite weights in cane rods, and very, very functional cane rods.
Fantastic.
And they're plowing very new ground with this. They've taken the material and they've moved it. They've moved the goalposts so far forward. And a lot of this is radical hollow building, steep tip drops, and a lot of other things. But then you look at a lot of these earlier rods, and even though they didn't have the hollow building, a lot of the more sophisticated ones had very steep tip drops. So I've cast rods that are close to 100 years old that feel like they were designed and built yesterday.
Wow.
But again, it's knowing the limitations and of the materials and what you can do with them.
Yeah.
You know?
So to hit you with the big question, to kind of round things up a little bit, and what would you say, if anything, is the goal or the end point or the aim of fly? What is fly fishing for? Is there an end goal with fly fishing, or is there something else that is what's a better way of defining what fly fishing is to you, and the influence that it's had on your life?
It's fly fishing for me, for a country boy from upstate New York, has, and very, someone of very, relatively modest means. It has opened so many doors for me, given me so many opportunities, for travel, for meeting people, for pursuing my own, my own happiness, my own goals. It's been the one constant in my life, that through good times and bad has always been there. And I've always wanted to kind of keep it in that context, that it is something apart that I can always go back to. For me, it's more than anything else, it's been about learning, and it's taken me down so many paths, just on how paper is made, for instance, and different types of printing, and early books and the way books are manufactured, let alone things like rods, but reels, and I'm not I don't have a mathematical mind or a scientific mind, but leader construction. I mean, we could talk, from my point, I could talk about leaders for the next hour, and these are all wonderful things. And as I get older, and I'm getting to that point where you can start to see the sunset, and every Hendrickson hatch I get is one I'm thankful for at this point, because most of them are behind me. It's just how much more there is to learn. And I just never get tired of it. I mean, I go through phases. I have a lot of other interests, but fly fishing is something I always come back to, and I just there's so much to know.
So perhaps the goal is not to master or complete fly fishing. Perhaps the aim is to keep playing the game. It's not to finish the game. It's to keep playing the game for as long as we're able to, and to keep learning the whole time.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful piece of a poem by, I believe it was William Herrick. I may be wrong about that. It's from a poem called Bat and Kill Funeral. And in it he says, "I kill a trout with fly to give the fish a half a chance, and hope my skill does not increase to lose the half that's mine." And I never want to be as good as I might be. I always want to, give the fish the half the chance.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Listen, I could literally talk about this for the rest of today, but I think at this point, that's just such a perfect point to leave it on. Again, I always kind of say this, particularly with, conversations that I've enjoyed. I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll do this. And my great hope is that beyond lockdown conditions and things, we can continue this conversation on a riverbank somewhere with fly and rod in hand.
Yeah, I do hope so. And I hope that maybe things will lighten up enough that I can get over in October for the grayling again this year. So, yeah.
I'd really look forward to that, and I'd welcome that opportunity for sure, John. But as I say, for now, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and let's do this again.
Absolutely, Paul. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah. Bye now.